Dear students, today we will study part 2 of chapter 1, Philosophy of the Constitution. What is political philosophy? All laws do not have a moral content, but many laws are closely connected to our deeply held values. We need to understand the conceptual structure of the Constitution. Now, what does this conceptual structure mean? It means that we must ask questions like what are the possible meanings of terms used in the Constitution such as rights, citizenship, minority, democracy. What do they actually stand for? That is what we have to know before we study the Constitution. So these are the terms which are described or written in our Constitution. We also need to know the coherent vision and polity of our Constitution, which means that we need to know what are the basic set of ideals that our Constitution talks about. Our Constitution talks about equality amongst all citizens. It talks about liberty or freedom to all citizens. And it also talks about justice to citizens. The third thing that we need to know is justification of values. The justification of values is embedded in our Constitution. A philosophical treatment of values is incomplete if a detailed justification for it is not provided. That is why the Constitution helps us to implement values and also give proper judgments, proper decisions on how these values have to be implemented. Next thing we need to know is Constitution as a means of democratic transformation. What does the Constitution do? That our country is democratically transformed. It restricts the exercise of power. We had studied in the first part that the Constitution gives powers to our government. It gives the powers of the executive, the legislature, the judiciary. Now, what if this government starts to misuse its power? It can happen that the government becomes tyrannical. We spoke about that as well. So, the Constitution gives some rules and regulations where the powers of the government are restricted. They have to exercise their powers within those restrictions. Only then will the country run properly. Secondly, it says provides means for social transformation. For a constitution, especially of colonized people, for those countries which were colonized, constitutions announce and embody the first real exercise of political self-determination. That those countries should be able to determine themselves. They should be able to work for themselves. And that is why it requires social transformation. So, what is the philosophy of the Constitution? It is liberal, democratic, egalitarian, secular and federal, open to community values, sensitive to the needs of religious and linguistic minorities, as well as historically disadvantaged groups, and committed to building a common national identity. And this philosophy of the Constitution is summarized in the preamble. What is the preamble? Preamble is the soul of the Constitution. It reflects the philosophy of the Constitution. It is the summary of the Constitution. You must have seen most of your textbooks have the preamble written in it. The first few pages, if you turn around of your textbooks, you will find the preamble in that textbook. This tells us what the Constitution is all about. It is like the summary of the Constitution. Just by reading the preamble, you come to know the main basic points which are mentioned in the Constitution, which can also be called as features of the Constitution. Let us look at them individually now. You can see there are around 16 features that have been mentioned which reflect what the Constitution is about. Detailed and written. Our Constitution is detailed. When the Constitution makers were making the Constitution, they saw to it that they put each and every point related to the country in our Constitution. It had the criticism of becoming very bulky, very big, but still, each and every point had to be written so that later our diverse country didn't face any problems, and they were all written down. There are constitutions which are unwritten, but Indian Constitution could not be unwritten. So it was detailed and written. Next, it is flexible and rigid. Flexible, it can be changed. It is like elastic. You can make amendments to it. Rigid, because there are some points in the Constitution which cannot be changed, which if changed would mar the basic concept of the constitution, and so they remained rigid. Federal government. We have said this again and again. Our country is very huge. It is very diverse. Just one form of government ruling over the country would not be possible. And so we followed the concept of government at the central level and government at the state level. Both work in unison, and that is why ours is a federalism or a federal form of government. Fundamental rights. I'm sure you have studied about this in your previous classes and you know very well what fundamental rights mean. You will study about this in the next chapter as well. These are basic rights which are given to the citizens of the country. When we have been given rights, we always also have some duties towards our country, and those have been listed under fundamental duties. While fundamental rights and fundamental duties are for the citizens of the country, we also have DPOSP, which can be elaborated as Directive Principle of State Policies. These are guidelines given to the states so that they work efficiently in the state. Next is independent and neutral judiciary. You know, we have 3 departments in our constitution, in our government, that is the executive, legislature and judiciary, out of which judiciary is independent. It is not dependent either on the executive or the legislature, so that it can act neutrally and not be biased. Next is single citizenship. We as Indians have a citizenship of the country. We do not have citizenship of the state. We may be UPites, we may be Keralites, we may be Tamil Nadians, we may be anybody. But when our citizenship is asked, we are Indians. Next is parliamentary form of government, where the parliament is supreme. Why is the parliament supreme? Because it is chosen by the citizens. The people sitting in the parliament are representative and accountable to the citizens of the country. And that is why we prefer to have a parliamentary form of government. Our constitution talks about social justice. Social justice means where we are providing equality to each and every member of the society, where the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, minorities, all of them are being given same kind of justice, similar justice and equality. National unity. Ours is a diverse country. We have people from all walks of life, from all religions, from all languages. And so it was important that the constitution speaks about unity, national unity, and keeps us all together. Secularism. With so many religions, if our country would have had a state religion, like some Islamic countries do, then our country would never have remained united. And that is why our constitution makers thought of keeping secularism as a feature of the constitution, where all religions are equal and the state does not have a religion. Respect for minority rights. When we got our independence and before our independence, our country suffered from what is commonly known as untouchability. People had a lot of prejudice against those who belonged to the lower communities, to the lower caste system that you can call. And that is why it was important that our constitution has a special place for minority rights, where the rights of all those who are dominated by the so-called majority or superior class have some kind of rights so that they can find an identity for themselves. The basic structure of the constitution was retained. It is seen that the constitution, the rigidity of the constitution is maintained here, and the basic structure of the constitution is retained. How many ever amendments you may make, you cannot change the basic structure of the constitution. Universal franchise. This was the only amendment which was made without any discussion. It was clearly agreed upon that anybody who is above the age, about a certain age, because first it was 21 and now it is 18, has the right to vote, right to elect their representatives who represent them in the parliament form of government. All these together give us a national identity. This is what tells us that we belong to India and we follow the Constitution of India, whatever our status may be. whichever group we may belong to. We all have Indian as a national identity. Let us see the procedural achievements of the Constitution. The first is political deliberation. The Indian Constitution reflects a faith in political deliberation. Deliberation is discussions. And that is why whatever concept is brought up, whatever idea is brought up, if there has to be an amendment, if a bill has to be passed, whatever has to happen, goes through an elaborate deliberation or elaborate discussion in the parliament. The debates in the assembly amply show that the makers of the constitution wanted to be as inclusive in their approach as possible. It also shows a willingness to recognize creative value in difference and disagreement. There may be chances where people do not agree to whatever the bill is being passed, to whatever law is being made. But then because of healthy deliberation, healthy discussions, the bill is passed with everybody's acceptance. Next is spirit of compromise and accommodation. This reflects that nothing should be disapproved. Not all compromises are bad. If something of value is trading off for mere self-interest, then we naturally have compromised in the bad sense. But in the constitution, the compromise and the accommodation is made keeping in mind the interests and the benefits of the citizens. They just do not accommodate or compromise on things where the citizens will be in harm. Such a big document, such an important document, but it was not free of criticisms. The criticisms of the constitution said that it was unwieldy. Unwieldy means it was very large, it was very bulky, and weak in complex, difficult to manage due to size. They felt that it was too big, but then there were so many things to compromise, too many things to add in the constitution that it had to be this big. Second criticism is it was an alien document. When we studied the chapter, when we started studying the chapter, we have studied how this constitution was borrowed from various other constitutions, like the British Constitution, the Irish Constitution, and that is why it has been told to be an alien document. But that was not so. The borrowing was done keeping in mind the Indian setup, and all that was borrowed today is the most important part of our constitution. It was also said to be unrepresentative. That is, that the franchise was adult franchise and constitutions were chosen by restricted franchise, not by universal suffrage. When our constitution makers were chosen, when the Constituent Assembly was made, universal franchise was not kept in mind, and that is why it has been called as unrepresentative. But at that time, people were not well educated, people did not know whom to choose, and that is why those people were chosen who had worked for the country in the independence of the country and who knew how exactly rules should be framed for the Indian people, and that is why universal franchise was not used. Lastly, we come to the last part of this chapter, limitations of the constitution. What are the limitations in the constitution? There are three limitations which have been mentioned in the constitution. First, the Indian constitution has centralized idea of national identity, of national unity, where people have given only one identity, that is Indian. And that is what was considered as a limitation of the constitution. They could have kept double citizenship. Second is gender justice. Gender justice is within the family, that everybody should be getting proper justice, and outside this kind of gender justice when the constitution started was not very visible. Socio-economic rights issues. It is not clear why in poor developing country certain basic socio-economic rights were relegated to the section on directive principles. They have not been kept as a fundamental right. They were kept as a part in the directive principles of state policy, whereas people feel that it should be put under socio-economic rights of fundamental rights.